And I'll now hand over the mic to Professor Rajaraman, please.
Thank you. So let me begin by thanking Ambassador Balakrishnan and Professor Chaturvedi for giving me this opportunity to participate in today's event. Dr. Kakodkar has worked, as you all know, in a wide variety of areas, and what I will do is just take one of them, because I have only 10 minutes or so, less in fact, I've just been told. So just take one of them and elaborate about it a little bit, and that is, of course, the India-US nuclear deal, which in fact figures as the largest chapter in the book, and to which, as we all know, Dr. Kakodkar, in which he played a very pivotal role. The deal took 3 years of negotiations, and Dr. Kakodkar had to very carefully balance during that period, as I could see as an outsider, I mean, I have no inner knowledge at all, carefully balance the need to remove sanctions, import uranium, and so on the one hand, and protect the strategic capability of the country in the other. And this balance is a difficult thing to do. Even people outside could see the balance was going on. I won't go over the making of the deal now, because that's an old story. It's been written about many times. Rather, I will talk about the aftermath of the deal. Primarily, I'll talk about how well have we taken advantage of the opportunities that have been provided by the nuclear deal, for which Dr. Kakodkar and our diplomats had worked so hard under the leadership of Dr. Manmohan Singh. So, in the aftermath of the deal, I'll divide the expected benefits which will accrue into 3 parts. One is the purchase of uranium, whose need was emphasized by Dr. Kakodkar already today. Second was the collaboration with foreign reactor suppliers to build state-of-the-art reactors in India to augment the indigenously built reactors so that we can have a speedier expansion of our nuclear energy sector. And thirdly was the acceptance by the international community as a responsible nuclear power, and thereby gain access to other technologies and other international groupings. So these were the kind of things that was expected to fall out of the deal. And let's see how we've done on those fronts, and I'm going to have to go very fast. Let me start with the uranium requirements. For that, we must only thing to remember is that there are 2 kinds of uranium we will need. Those which are imported will come with safeguards, which means that the IAEA will be following it till its end, and therefore it cannot be used for military or weapon purposes. So you can only use imported uranium for civilian reactors. So one must take a list of the civilian reactors we have now and those we are likely to make, and make an estimate of how much uranium you will need for that. We have 10 pressurized heavy water reactors already, and which are on the civilian side. There are others in the military side, but as I said, that doesn't involve the import issue. And 10 more are going to be built according to the government announcement. So if I take roughly 6 out of 10 as the usual 2/3 ratio will be civilian, I have about 16 reactors, PHWRs, for which I have to find imported uranium. Of course, we also have other reactors. We have 2 boiling water reactors at Tarapur, but the fuel for that is a separate deal. It's been a problem that's been there from the beginning, and arrangements have been made with individual countries. So I will leave that out. And also the foreign supplied reactors that we hope to have, and some of which are already coming, the fuel for that will be provided by the supplier. So once again, we of course pay for it, it's still import, but we don't have to go hunting for it. So it's really the civilian reactors of the 16 ones that I talked about. And I made a rough estimate that is going off this way or that, just a physicist's estimate. I thought we'd require something like 14,000 to 15,000 tons of uranium to run them for 15-year period. I wish I could show these numbers. So 15,000 tons. And in this, there has been considerable progress. There's one aspect of the deal's benefits that we've really done well on. And so various countries, starting with Kazakhstan, which is the world's largest source of uranium, Uzbekistan, Canada, Australia, France, and Russia, have all agreed to export to us uranium. And I won't go over the individual numbers, we don't have time, but already Kazakhstan has promised 5,000 tons, Uzbekistan 2,000 tons, Canada 3,000 tons, and so forth, and some of which has already come. In fact, almost 8,000 tons of natural uranium has already been imported, sitting there. So compared to the 14,000 I mentioned as what we are likely to need in the next 15 years, even give or take 1,000, if its estimate's wrong, we are doing reasonably well already. So I think on the import front, we have taken advantage of what the deal offered us. Now, collaboration on building reactors, things are a little bit more dicey. In the beginning, as soon as the deal was opened up, all the three countries with reactor-making ability, giants at that time, France, Russia, and the US, their suppliers were just waiting for the deal, and the moment it was released, terms of agreements were made with NPCIL. Areva was given 2 reactors to build at Chaitapur. Rosatom of Russia was given 8 reactors at Haripur. And US, both Westinghouse and Hitachi, were also permitted certain number of reactors. Location at that time was not known to me, at least. So things looked hunky-dory. 2009, 2010, first 2 years after the deal, there was plenty for everybody to go, and there were no rivalry because there were different types of reactors. So all the countries got what they wanted, and things looked very good. But then there were 2 developments that happened which were set back. One is Fukushima happened in 2011. And that was a major setback for the nuclear industry globally. Different countries reacted differently. Germany, for instance, we know is one extreme, completely closed down its reactor program. Existing reactors would be closed down in 12 years and so on. Other countries reacted differently. In India, we decided to continue with our nuclear plants after a full safety review. And although Fukushima inspired, if I may say so, spirited anti-nuclear protests at Kottamangalam did take place, we all know about it, it did not significantly delay our larger nuclear plants. So there was no delay because of that. There is some hassle, but no delay. But the second development, which is the Nuclear Liability Act, which we also set in, was in fact a source of considerable delay. So let me say a little bit about that. Naturally, with so many reactor deals in the offing, the government had to have a civil liability law for nuclear damage, and it did put in before the parliament a bill in 2010. Now, it so happens, at that time, it was also the 25th anniversary of the Bhopal tragedy. So, protest speeches and so on were going on in Jantar Mantar, almost within hearing distance of the parliament. And so the opposition was really very fired up on the issue of making sure that this time they won't get away with it, they being unspecified. So there were 2 results of this. One is a positive result, that because of the Bhopal experience, the Liability Act was much more progressive than what used to exist before. In particular, the Nuclear Liability Act set up a liability to the operator of 15,000 crores. That's a substantial chunk of money, 300 SDRs roughly. And then time-bound legal steps for speedy compensation. So within 3 months of the report of a damage filed, money would have to be paid to the victim. These were very, very good things, and people who know about how things happened in Bhopal will realize what a difference this will make. This was on the plus side. But on the minus side, the surge of strong public opinion that the government was lax in Bhopal and let Union Carbide get away with murder, opposition also was inspired to demand a liability law which was strict. So we brought out a liability law which was in fact stricter than anything anywhere else, in the following sense, that it would include a certain amount of supplier liability. If something goes wrong, and in the first instance, the operator, which is of course DAE, would pay, but they can in turn take action against the supplier under certain conditions. This is very normal because if your automobile, there's an accident, the driver of the car is liable, the tire manufacturer is liable, and the auto company is liable, everybody is liable. But in the nuclear game, that was not so. The architecture had been so set up really by the US that nuclear suppliers were not liable for damage. And so all the existing agreements, there's some Vienna understanding of protocol where this was not there, and we were the first country to do this. And what we had done was that 2 sections of that Act of 2010, our Liability Act, there's Section 17, which was discussed all over the newspaper, 17A, 17B, 17C, and all that, which gives the reactor operator the right to sue the suppliers under certain conditions. There was another item in the less widely advertised item in the Act, with Section 46, which said, notwithstanding what the Act says, a member of the public is always entitled to use the laws of the country, the law of torts. So somebody living 10 miles away from the explosion could say, look, I've been hurt, and you can go to court. And there is no limit on that set by the Act. So understandably, foreign suppliers were very upset, especially by Article 46. Government made several attempts to allay their concerns, but they were not sufficient. And in the process of doing all that, time ran out, and the Manmohan Singh-led government came to the end of its term. But things started moving again with the new Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, who, as you know, embarked on a personal diplomacy blitzkrieg around the world with world leaders. His visit to the US, as you all know, was a great success. And in turn, President Obama attended our Republic Day functions, and Modi visited the US again twice. So between these visits, these two leaders enjoined their respective officials to resolve the problem quickly. This thing was stuck and it shouldn't be stuck. So I believe midnight oil was burnt and compromises were hammered out, and the following outcomes came out. One is that India would facilitate the insurance problem for the liability. A 1,500 crore rupee insurance pool was to be created, led by our own GIC, which is highly reputed. And India also gave an assurance that this Section 46, where law of torts can be used by any member of the public, will apply only to the operator and not to the supplier. Despite that, other problems came. Westinghouse, one of the anticipated suppliers, went broke. It declared bankruptcy. And Areva, the other company that was supposed to supply us reactors from France, also went broke and said its financial reports will not be published for 2 years. So there has been great difficulty because of these things. I'm going to run over some slides and give it. So as things stand, neither Areva, further deals have been made now to facilitate matters, but the one country where, in fact, things moved very fast is Russia. And it's been an all-weather friend on nuclear issues. And in particular here, they've been building reactors for us even before the deal. That's done by what's called grandfathering. You say that you come to an understanding to build the reactor long before the sanctions were put. So we are allowed to do that. And the international community agreed to that or looked the other way. In fact, they've done the same thing for China and Pakistan. China is building reactors against all nuclear supply regulations in Pakistan. So Russians were already building reactors. But once the deal came, they had agreements to build many more right at Kodangulam. So agreements were signed for reactors 3 and 4, then 5 and 6, and then 6 more reactors are planned. So the Russian collaboration is going extremely well, I would say. There are problems, bugs with the reactors. That's a technical issue that I won't go into now. What has happened in the Areva and the French front is that an arrangement is being worked out now where our company, Larsen & Toubro, would collaborate to a larger extent in the building of the French reactor. This would be, of course, good. Not only will it give our Make in India component a boost, but it would also enable the cost to come down because, as was mentioned, things can be made cheaper in India than elsewhere. So I think there is some hope that with this collaboration, we may be able to get the French reactors and perhaps also the Americans going. Right now, the talk is that they're all on, but the talk that are all on, I've heard for a long time now. So one is cautious. Finally, let me talk about other kinds of fallout that I mentioned. Here, the diplomats in the room know much better than I do. Because of the entry into the US nuclear India deal, we were also given the status of being responsible nuclear power, etc., and given entry to other groupings. In particular, in pure science, ITER, the Plasma Fusion Research Laboratory in France, where India is a major player, and my friend Pradyuman was a major actor in that, that scientific collaboration we've been given a part of. We are working as a partner in that. Then, as you all know, other regimes like MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime, Wassenaar, and the Australia Group are all groupings into which we have been now given entry, really because of the nuclear deal and so on. Of course, we want also entry into NSG, and it's supported by many nations, but blocked by our good friend, the Chinese. So there the matters are pending. And the membership to all this was achieved through the hard work of our diplomats and would not have been possible had the deal not been negotiated. So we must thank Dr. Kakodkar for his contributing in shepherding that pivotal deal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajaraman. Now I invite Mr. Pallav Bagla to give a different perspective to this whole thing.
Namaskar. It is such a pleasure to be here and to share a dais with Dr. Kakodkar. Normally I sit on the other side of the table asking him questions. I have had a long association with the Department of Atomic Energy, reporting about stuff nuclear, both vegetarian and non-vegetarian. People in DAE would understand that. And had great opportunity to look at Dr. Kakodkar's work at close quarters. At the start, I would say that, like everybody has been quibbling about the title, I also quibble about the title. I think Dr. Kakodkar's book does not merit the title Fire and Fury. Over 15 years or maybe longer association, I have never seen him angry. I have never seen him furious. Cool, quiet, contemplative, introspective, and visionary are the adjectives I would use for Dr. Kakodkar. I have seen what a lonely path he was leading. I remember the day when the summit was happening with President George Bush Jr. in Hyderabad House. All the other diplomats walked in. There are many diplomats in the room in Hyderabad House with an entourage. Dr. Kakodkar walked in very lonely, probably the last to enter the room. And there's a picture of him in the Marathi version of his biography. This is an autobiography. I would urge people who know Marathi to read the Marathi version, which has also just come out. I presume that is better and more juicy than this. Now, to take forward the same perspective of Mahabharat, other characters have been discussed. One character has not, and I was probably Sanjay in all of this, being the reporter who was relaying. There was Raj Chengappa in the room, Prasannan is there, others who have also reported the Indo-US civilian nuclear deal and Pokhran, etc. But I was the television man, so some way Sanjay would fit. The points where I thought the book would dwell a little more would be the whole issue of the 1974 Pokhran explosions and the 1998 Pokhran explosions. Dr. Kakodkar gives it only a chapter. I think it merits 2 books. I don't know whether Suresh is capable of doing that or somebody else has to take on the mantle, do it alongside with Dr. Chidambaram, and then recall, because I think the history of those 2 experiments needs to be documented in very fine detail and not just in the Bollywood style of Parmanu, where you see Dr. Kakodkar eating golgappas. I don't know whether he eats golgappas. I asked him, I haven't asked him. The one point, you haven't seen the movie. Well, that's another quibble I have with the scientific community. You need to get engaged with Bollywood. If Bollywood is engaging with the Indian scientific community, if Mission Mangal is coming, Parmanu is coming, there would be another Chandrayaan 2. I think high time the scientific community got engaged fully with the Bollywood film industry because they have great impact. In addition, they made 200 crores, which is Mission Mangal. So there has to be some interest there. One point where I felt the book gave me new insight was on Dr. Kakodkar's upbringing, which was the upbringing where he spent enormous time in a Gandhian style upbringing with his mother. And I would urge a response from him as to how did he reconcile the Gandhian approach of non-violence and then to go to the other extreme of doing atomic weapons and hydrogen bombs at Pokhran in 1998. As a person, because this is about the person and the biography, I would urge him to reconcile that for me as to how did he reconcile in his mind the deep upbringing he had with his mother in the Gandhian ashram and this. The other point I might like to bring up is a point which Professor Rajaraman mentioned, the failure of getting imported reactors from France and France and America. I have written about it, and I personally felt it is a blessing in disguise. They were far too expensive, and we probably are better off. We've been able to import uranium, and 10 PHWR 700 megawatts are on the roll. So is that a blessing in disguise? Because we call sanctions and technology denial a blessing in disguise. So post in the 21st century, is this another blessing in disguise? Most recently, I would bring one point to your attention. Dr. Kakodkar, post writing of his book, has been in the news for the so-called cyber hacking which took place and the use of the Pegasus software. We've done an interview on that and his thoughts on whether his computer was hacked and what happened. I can come back, I can recount what happened to me 2 years into the nuclear deal. I was reporting very extensively, literally like a shuttlecock. It was going back and forth. 2 or 3 years into the deal, just before President Bush was coming, from my computer, anything where I wrote nuclear or atomic just wouldn't go out. What happened? I have no idea. No emails would go out whenever I typed anything nuclear or atomic. Now, how did we go about reporting? Fall back to good old days. Landline telephone and dictations. So my boss on the other end would take a dictation and I would do it on a landline. There were no mobile phones at that point, not deep penetration of mobile phones. So you can imagine that were the listening capabilities of the people who were for and against the deal, that they were monitoring what is happening to individual correspondents. The other point where I have a small issue with Dr. Kakodkar, I thought he should have dealt a little more on the fast breeder reactor, not just because both of us were deeply involved in that interview where fast breeder reactors came up strongly, but that there has been such a long delay in the commissioning of India's prototype fast breeder reactor. It's still not up and functional. We should be having it up and running soon. But I would suggest that all of you read the book. I think it's a fantastic recount of what happened. It's literally a first-person account. I have been waiting for it for a very long time, and I finished reading I'm a very slow reader. I finished reading the book in less than 24 hours. That is the pace at which you can imagine he recounts, and some of the credit I think should go to Suresh ji for that. But it's a book worth reading, and I hope time will not take its toll and we will see another 2 books, one on 74 and one on 1998, recalling great detail on what happened so that those learnings remain with India and Indians, and how we were able to hoodwink CIA and do the blasts, and not just the Parmanu Pokhara Bollywood way, but the real story behind it. With these few words, I would say Dr. Kakodkar has been very generous with his time whenever I needed in recounting the happenings during the deal, post-deal, subsequently, even now. And it's been a journey together, and a journey where both of us have sought energy independence and not just energy security. I think for the country, we deeply need energy independence. If we have to grow at the way we do, the 1.3, 1.5, 1.6 billion people which we are going to be soon, if they have to meet their requirements, we need energy independence. With that thought, I will close. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bagla, for your very incisive remarks. we now have some time which is for discussion. So questions, I see hands. Okay, please keep your questions focused and to the point. Ambassador Chinnoy?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kakodkar. In 2016, we concluded the civil nuclear deal with Japan. And in 2017, I worked very hard as ambassador to steer it through the Japanese diet. How relevant is the deal with Japan, in your view, to our nuclear program, considering that Japan signed such a deal with a non-NPT country for the first time? It was a huge deal for us. Secondly, that they do make all the steel crucibles for just about everybody, including Areva, Hitachi, Toshiba, as in GE, Westinghouse, etc. The second question is flowing from what Mr. Rajaraman said, that Germany has decided to eventually phase out the 12 nuclear reactors that it has. But Germany has also decided to phase out by 2025 all its coal-fired plants. So then, considering that France, on the other hand, relies overwhelmingly on nuclear energy, but has also decided to phase out its coal-fired plants even earlier, by 2022, and on the other hand, Japan, which shut down all its nuclear plants after Fukushima, 50 plus, except for a couple of experimental ones, is determined to go ahead with setting up 22 new coal-fired plants. I mean, where do we go? What's the answer? These are high-tech countries with experience of both coal and nuclear. What's the way ahead for India? Thank you.
I think we take 2 or 3 questions. Ambassador Gare Khan.
Thank you, Dr. Kakodkar. I also would like to thank Dr. Rajaraman for his views on the subject. I have 2 questions, and please forgive me if they are too naive sounding or elementary. One is that the nuclear deal, in which you played a crucial role, made it possible for us to import fuel, uranium, from wherever. Our constraint, our major constraint, or perhaps the only constraint in developing nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, was lack of adequate uranium in the country. So once the nuclear deal made it possible for us to get the fuel from many other countries, it seems to me that it was not really necessary for us or essential for us to go in for foreign-made reactors. Now, I know that I'm sure there is a political aspect to it, because Americans feel that they have gone out of their way to get us out of the scientific embargo, and so they expected, or perhaps they still do, that they will get some return for their political investment in our nuclear deal. But strictly speaking, I presume that we really don't need foreign reactors, because I think, as you said, our technology is second to none, so we can do it on our own, importing uranium from abroad. My second question is about deterrence. Both Pakistan and India have nuclear weapons, so I suppose some kind of a mutual deterrence is obtaining between our 2 countries. But it seems to me that we are more deterred by Pakistan's nuclear weapons than the other way around. It has been shown up in Kargil time, and I think it seems to me that we are the ones who are getting more deterred, because as Prime Minister Manmohan Singh himself told me once, that we are a soft state, and we continue to be a soft state irrespective of what Mr. Modi says. So in that situation, what have we got? If we are, because Pakistan, we are convinced ourselves that Pakistan can act irrationally, and they will go to any extent, and they will say that also, that they will go tactical and other kinds of weapons. But we are rather, I think Professor Rajaraman has written also about it, that if we don't have the political will to take the next step, then what are we doing? Thank you.
Ambassador Deepak Vora. Then we'll go to the replies.
Dr. Anil Kakodkar, my name is Deepak Vora, sir. Privileged to meet an outstanding son of India like you. Sir, your title, Fire and Fury, is the motto of 14 Corps based in Leh. So we might be asking you for royalties. Just be careful about that, sir. I'm privileged to serve as special advisor in Leh. So my question here is the pace at which we are moving in solar energy, meeting our targets years ahead of schedule. We are racing ahead, sir. And of course, the sun itself is the big nuclear thing which is giving us this energy. Do you see a time in the next 15, 20, 30 years when solar will replace nuclear, sir? Thank you, sir.
Well, first of all, let me thank all my co-panelists for their own independent take on the book and what they expect, and also I think some very important questions that have been raised. First, talking about getting Japan into the equation and talking about how do we reconcile Japan wants to continue with nuclear program in spite of Fukushima, and here is Germany who is phasing out nuclear because of Fukushima. I think this is bound to happen in the sense the energy policies, or for that matter any other key national policies, I would say are natural to expect that they would be decided by respective sovereign states, taking into account their own circumstances. And I think the answer to that question lies in that circumstances. See, Japan, it's a very tiny island state with large economic activity. So energy security for Japan is a huge big problem compared to most of the other countries, and particularly for a country where in terms of the population their energy needs are high, because essentially their exports have to be much higher for their economy to survive and grow and things like that. Nuclear energy is central to their energy security, because whatever they can generate using renewable solar and wind, they will do, they are doing, but that won't be very large because the landmass is not very large. They are of course importing a lot of fossil energy, but fossil energy for a geography like Japan is a invitation to a serious energy insecurity problem. And so I think there is no way Japan would in fact, the whole sensitivity of atomic energy is because of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and current fear about nuclear reactors or power plants is because of Fukushima. But I think it's only logical that Japan is maintaining nuclear as a part of its energy mix, as a part of policy. In fact, the Japanese parliament made that decision without too much of time elapsed after Fukushima. In fact, the shutdown of the reactors and review and bringing them online was a long drawn process. But I think moment that they had a group which gave a report on what happened in Fukushima and then advised the government in terms of what should be the energy policy from here onwards. They in fact straight away took it to their parliament diet or whatever, and there is a resolution there that nuclear would remain a part of energy mix in Japan. So they are very clear about it. Now that does not mean that I think in Japanese public mind there is a huge sensitivity about nuclear,
And so anything they do in nuclear, they have to weigh in this part. There is a huge politics, local politics behind this. And that's one reason why the Indo-Japan civil nuclear cooperation actually took so much of time. Otherwise, it would have happened quite speedily. Clearly, from Indian perspective, I think cooperation with Japan is extremely important from a variety of angles. See, the Japanese company, and they also had financial problems, and the business is not as big as it was, and but I think this will come back, and the Hitachis and the Toshibas, they have tremendous both infrastructure to make, for example, the forging, as pressure vessels, as you referred to, or even other aspects of nuclear technology. I must reveal here, immediately after Fukushima, I had nothing to do with, I had retired by then, but Japanese people invited me there. I spent almost a week in Japan talking to these companies, because they are thinking about how their strategies would evolve. And there was a huge desire at the company level in terms of developing cooperation with India. Now, I'll come to German phase out in a moment, but I'll take up the next question and then again come back to this. Why are we importing, or why did we factor in import of nuclear reactors as a part of civil nuclear cooperation? And I think you're absolutely right. It was, any cooperation is a give and take. And we're not so much technology dependent. But if I can narrate a story, is there, part of it is there in the book. Even when we did the 1998 nuclear tests, soon thereafter, after that, there was a big upheaval and the embargo regime became tighter and all. But both the French and the Russians, they had approached us saying that now let's see how we can move forward. And Ambassador Sibal is here and he is privy to this, at least as far as Russians are concerned. And the question was, there was this debate as to how we make these things move forward. And the single conclusion of all this was, because this is a matter of global architecture, particularly nuclear suppliers group, the countries are bound by that. And unless the United States comes on board, this problem cannot be solved. So it was like those two countries telling India that, well, why don't you deal with United States, and India telling those two countries, why don't you deal with United States? And I'm sure between Russians and French also they must be saying, why don't you deal with United States? So I don't want to get into who went first, who went second and all. But everybody felt there was actually consensus that you have to bring United States into the equation. And luckily there are many other factors which were becoming favorable. It's not just the nuclear, but the politics just worked right at that point of time. And creating business opportunities for all the three countries was obviously clearly a part of that deal. So in that sense, as was mentioned, I'm not too worried about there is a delay in the French or the American or even the Russian if it takes place. Luckily it's going on well. I think we can get on with domestic nuclear energy program. using Indian technology and uranium from wherever. When I say wherever, uranium from abroad as well as domestic uranium. So that is not an issue. Having said that, I think we must recognize the fact that this technology linkages or equipment linkages also have a huge opportunity for us. And that opportunity is, for example, why the French and the American negotiations are taking so much of time. I think the primary reason is they are currently not very viable. They are trying to do financial engineering. But the crux of the matter, and which I have been telling even them, even at that time, that look, unless you enhance domestic value addition in India, create joint ventures between the industries in those countries and Indian companies, and start manufacture of critical equipment in India, you will not be able to compete. I must tell you that in terms of actual work, a pressurized water reactor or a light water reactor has less work than heavy water reactor. So, if you make a like for like comparison, the cost of light water reactor, PWR or BWR, should in principle be much lower than heavy water reactors. The reality today is the other way. Our reactors are the cheapest, then come Russian, and we don't know where the French are. So, I think the point of advantage is if we can create conditions where the Indian manufacturing for nuclear reactors becomes a big activity, triggered by this cooperation for reactors, we will of course have some megawatt addition, some nuclear power addition. But I think we will have a much larger manufacturing base, and I would say not just for the Indian market, but for the world market. Now, this is also a part of, just like we talked about science, diplomacy and a light linkage. I think here again, I think several actors have to play together. But I think, if I can digress beyond the questions, but it's very important from Indian perspective. And that is, I talked about the climate change issue, the global concern. Now, everybody is talking about their own conditions. Now, the real threat to climate change, according to me, is from the emerging economy countries. Many of them are small, and they will have energy needs which they will meet, and in absence of technology availability, they will meet that out of fossil fuel. And that will be the net addition. Advanced countries which are capable of building reactors for themselves, they might build new reactor, but their need, their per capita energy consumption is not going to go up. So they might build reactor only to replace a power plant which is being phased out or things like that. That's not the growth story in overall energy terms. The growth story in overall energy terms lies in emerging economic countries. And of course, India and China are the two big ones, but there are many other small ones. And I think it is that market which lies ahead of us, and if we can make a nuclear product which is competitive, which is consistent with their needs, and you make them in India and supply, you can imagine the amount of opportunity lies ahead of us. And that to me is the real advantage of this cooperation, because after all they have a brand. Whatever you may say, we may say PHWR is globally best, but there is a can-do brand, and business works on the brand. So similarly, there is a Westinghouse brand, there is a Areva or EDF brand. And I think if we want to enhance Indian export business in nuclear, we can leverage our linkages with these brands. So, but frankly, I don't know whether we have gone that far. But I think there is a huge, big game plan. And I come back to Japan in that context, because all these people have been dependent on Japan, whether it's in even French, but certainly Americans. They need Japan for some of their product supplies. because of their. Now, why is it why can't have a direct link with Japan or even South Korea? So I am actually a champion of the fact that, well, we have these deals with these three major players, and that, of course, should remain on our agenda. We should try to make as fast a progress as possible. But I think we should open yet another side and open it up for competitive bidding. And I'm sure none of these three will win. The people who might win will be either the Koreans or the Japanese. And get them in. It will do several good things, both in terms of making the projects competitive, but also in terms of establishing India as a major nuclear supplier. Because I think the market lies in a place where there is no nuclear right now. So that's why Japan, I think, is very important to me. Now, then there was this question about deterrence and how deterrence work in a society or nation which has a soft mindset. Now that, of course, nuclear technology is not going to find an answer. That is, but I think the deterrence works. Well, the way you articulate and all that is very important, clearly. So, because it's after all a poker's game, you must know where to speak and where to keep quiet. But I think deterrence ultimately, at the end of the day, also depends on how strong you are perceived, whether you say it so or you don't say it so. And I think in terms of comparison of Indian capability and strength, I think there is no issue. According to me, there is a huge asymmetry. So I wouldn't be terribly worried on that. Although I agree with you that deterrence is a game that should be played. Because if you allow deterrence to fail, then in spite of best of technology, it's not going to be of any use. But I'll leave it at that. I think it's a. Now, on the question of solar power, I think that solar power is growing is a very good thing, and I think it should happen. Only thing is, there are a couple of things which, in fact, I was the first chairman of Solar Energy Corporation of India, and but somehow in our mindset, just like any other domain, even in solar is no exception. The thing was that you make a policy, invite bidders, get the tenders in place, and then give contracts or assign projects. That's the way it is going. And that's largely the reason why the photovoltaic is going, because the prices have come down, it makes big business sense, they are very competitive. So there are all positive arguments there. There is a flip side to that, and that flip side is, number one, we are costing solar on the basis of projects. Now, which is fine. Whosoever has promoted the project, the policy, the regulator, everybody is happy, users are very happy. As the percentage of solar energy in the grid grows up, you will find, because these are all variable energies, the grids will become increasingly difficult to manage. This is an experience in Germany. And so you have to stabilize the grid, and there is a cost to that. And that cost, it depends on the level of penetration, and this becomes a big issue only when solar energy becomes maybe 30%, 50%, 60%. Beyond that, I can't even imagine. But when that happens, you'll have to incur significant amount of costs in the overall system and also grids. And also there is an issue about, in the system, there is an issue about stranded assets, which we are already facing even now in the context of coal. Now, people who have set up solar plants now, they have got away with it. These plants will run for 15 years or 20 years or whatever, and they will make their money. The later entrants, when the solar penetration is of the order of 30%, 35, 40%, the taxpayer will have to incur additional expenditure for what I am saying. And who will pay that? Naturally, only taxpayer will pay that. Now, if taxpayer has to pay that, it has to be figured out and accounted for in our policy making. I don't see that happening. Now, this is not small. This could be as large as investment in solar itself. And there are many reports available on this. So I think that's one thing we need to. But otherwise, I think growing solar is a good thing which is happening.
The Americans can't put sanctions on the sun.
Well, but they can put sanctions on the supplies. Trade barriers could still come because solar, everything is imported. 80-85% is still imports. So that issue can still arise, but I think unlikely to arise. So we can be comfortable on that. Now, there is a bigger problem, and a bigger problem is, see, solar is dependent on battery. Battery technology is evolving, but it is not to a level where it can make big impact at the grid level. We are implying that the battery is an issue, and I will not go into detail there. But from that perspective, I think solar thermal for large capacity, for rooftop and smaller thing is fine, photovoltaic, but for large capacity solar plants, any day according to me, solar thermal is a better option. The problem with solar thermal is solar thermal plant has to be custom engineered. It has to be engineered plant by plant. Like photovoltaic, I can't order, a unitized product and I want 1 megawatt, I'll order so many panels. 2 megawatts, I will order double the number of panels. That is, so the dynamics with photovoltaic is of a different kind, so it works well. But if you are able to do customized engineering, and I think there is a cost advantage doing so in India. Unfortunately, we don't do it. And that's why whenever you invite a tender, you will find solar thermal comes out to be very expensive. So it has gone out of our consideration, which I think is a mistake. But if you do that, you will address the problem of storage, because thermal storage is any day much cheaper than battery storage. But that is aside. But going towards the so-called carbon-free energy supply or carbon-free world, I think renewable energy by themselves cannot handle this problem. And you must have a certain minimum fraction of non-fossil baseload energy. And in Indian context, at the present moment, other than nuclear, there is no non-fossil baseload energy. So I don't see how India can survive in the long run without a larger fraction of nuclear. So we need to catch up. I think I have addressed all the questions.
I have a question.
Well, look, I think what we'll do is, because I think we will be here over lunch, so we can discuss it over lunch, if you permit.
Just
And
one question.
okay. Last question.
What about
I'm Arvinder Singh Brara, Chairman and Managing Director of Mantech Consultants. We are in the field of environment, and therefore my question is oriented towards that. What about nuclear waste? Is that a concern? Is that being addressed? And it might be a solution in the short run to put it under the carpet, but what about the long-term impact?
Well, no, waste problem India has not put under the carpet. It has actually brought to the forefront of international community right from day one. See, the nuclear waste problem that the world is concerned about arises out of the fuel policies that countries adopt. For example, countries like United States and many other countries in the world, they adopt what is known as the open fuel cycle policy or once through fuel cycle policy. So you put a fuel in the reactor, get energy out of it, out comes the spent fuel, which for these countries is a waste. So there are huge inventory which is arising of that kind of waste, which is very high level waste, and frankly there is no solution how to dispose that. And that's the problem for countries which have shunned what is known as recycle, fuel recycle. And they have done so because of their proliferation concerns. If you recycle, you will separate fissile contents, plutonium particularly, which may get diverted to weapon purposes and all. So they said, okay, no recycle. And so the waste is, if you don't, the antidote for waste problem is to recycle, anyway, nuclear or non-nuclear. Now, India, right from day one, has been a champion of spent fuel recycle. And we have developed technologies for doing so. So, if you recycle, the entire uranium, plutonium, you actually recycle, which takes care of almost 95 to 98% of the waste. What remains is good part of that is actually not very long lived. So it decays fast, and whatever can be conditioned and disposed of by vitrifying it, putting it in glass matrix. India has gone one step further, and of course I must recognize that France is the leader, but we are not very far behind. And that is, you not only remove and recycle uranium, plutonium, but you also remove and recycle actinides. So much so you can also remove and recycle or put to use some of the long-lived fission products, for example, cesium. And we of course have full industrial scale technologies on the recycle of uranium, plutonium. We have demonstration scale technologies for recycle of actinides, and we have little bigger than demonstration scale for recycle of things like cesium. So, according to me, for India, waste is not a problem. It is because we are all conditioned with American logic. And you are right, waste is a huge, big problem globally. In fact, soon after my retirement, I was invited by IAEA to be the conference chair for a conference on nuclear spent fuel management. And right in my opening remarks in the conference, where all the top experts in the field were there, I declared that disposal of spent fuel as spent fuel is an unresolved issue and will remain unresolved for all time to come. And not one soul got up and challenged. It is yet to be challenged, and it will not be challenged. So that is the problem. It's not a problem for India.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attention and for your lively questions, and to the panelists for enlivening this discussion. Thank you, Dr. Kakotkar, for
Thank you for having
your
us.
presentation. And I'd like to then invite you all to have lunch with us and continue in an informal setting.
Stand up, sit down. What is
Stand
it?
up. Photo-